What have we learned overall in this lecture? We examined what determines yields on government bonds and why they change. We decomposed Treasury yields into real yields, expected inflation, and an inflation risk premium. At the most basic level, Treasury yields change because one or more of these components changes. That is to say that either the real discount rate is changed because market participants require more consumption tomorrow to forego a unit of consumption today, or expected inflation has changed, market participants believe there will be more of it, or the risk premium for inflation has increased. Perhaps markets demand more compensation for the possibility that their inflation forecasts might be wrong. If you're planning on holding a bond to maturity and using the proceeds to fund your consumption, then the only risk you really face is pure inflation risk. If your horizon for consumption is longer or shorter than the maturity of the bond, then an investor cares about all of these risk components: real interest rates, expected inflation, and the inflation risk premium. If you want to consume before the bond matures, you have to sell the bond, and the price you get at that time will depend on all of these three factors. If you want to consume after the bond matures, you have to reinvest the proceeds, and the yield at which you do that will also depend on all three of these factors. These issues also come up in deciding on whether to buy a bond fund or individual bonds. If you plan to liquidate a bond fund, a mutual fund or ETF, in order to spend the money, or if you need to meet a fixed liability and are trying to do it with a bond fund, then the fund, which is a rolling ladder, subjects you to the interest rate risks inherent in buying individual bonds. If you would have built a ladder anyway, perhaps because you're constantly reinvesting the money, then the bond fund provides good diversification and liquidity at low costs. Finally, we studied TIPS, which are one of the main instruments for investing in bonds without taking on the risk of inflation. TIPS are a very useful tool for retirement planning because they guarantee a real stream of purchasing power. But their market is still somewhat small, and it may be that governments are reluctant to issue too much in the way of TIPS. If government debt were all in TIPS, it would remove the government's option to inflate away its debts. What key issues remain to be understood after this lecture about bonds? Really, the main thing is that we have not yet studied bonds issued by other entities, such as corporations or state and local governments. These bonds carry some of the same risks as investing in treasuries, but also an important additional risk, the risk that the issuer will default, not through inflation, since these issuers don't control their own currency, but just by not making the promised payments. How that possibility of true payment default affects bond yields, and how sensitive bond yields are to news about the issuers of defaultable bonds, is an important further topic for bond investors to understand.